I think we'll kick off. We got people joining us as we speak. So you're all very, very welcome to this IoD Surrey Connect. And it's the second in our mini series of returning to the workplace. It's a bit like the mayor of Amity, isn't it? Sort of course it's safe to go back into the water. And as directors and partners and business leaders, we obviously want to make sure that it is going to be safe and correct to be going back into the workplace as we sort of contemplate that step. I'm delighted to be sharing today with Michelle Tudor. Michelle is an employment and immigration solicitor at Moore Barlow, and she serves as an ambassador on my IoD Surrey committee. And we'll be hearing from Michelle very, very shortly. A few things before we kick off. We're all here to share our knowledge, skills, experience and expertise. So please, as we go through the session, please do feel free to contribute in the chat area. And I would ask you please to mute yourselves. And there's a little bit of noise online at the moment. Please do mute yourselves and unmute yourself when you wish to speak. We're going to also ask you to just stop your video camera, apart from myself and Michelle, purely because that makes the video, which we are recording, that makes the video sort of more palatable when people view this online. As we go through, I'm going to be asking you to also be asking questions of Michelle. And we'll have time for a full Q&A. We'll have half an hour for a full Q&A. So get your questions ready for Michelle. And if you want to sort of get a question out there, please put it into the chat with a capital Q in the front, and then I will scan down and I will call you to ask your question to the room, as it were. You will see in the chat area a link to an evaluation, an online evaluation form. It'll only take you a minute to complete, but Polly, who is the salaried member of the IoD, as opposed to me, who's the voluntary chair, we're very keen to make sure that all of our IoD Surrey events meet the expectations of our members and the wider business community within which we serve. So please do take a moment to share your thoughts on that in the evaluation form. I'll put it up in a minute, and then I'll put it up again towards the end. But for now, all that remains for me to do is to pass you over to Michelle. Michelle, thank you so much for your time today, and over to you.
No problem. So morning, everybody. So managing the return to your workplace is our theme for this morning. Looking at really sort of the legal and the practical implications of getting your workforce back to work, whether they're furloughed or whether they are working from home. We've all sort of seen the government's plan to sort of come out of the lockdown over a period of time. They really want to be able to boost the economy, and to be able to do that, they need your business to be up and running as much as possible, and that means getting your employees back to work. But of course, it's not that simple, and there are a number of things that you need to think about. So there are a number of things that I'm going to talk you through this morning for the next half an hour about your health and safety obligations. It really starts with health and safety, making sure your workplace is COVID-19 secure, with a particular focus on what your risk assessment might look like, how you might control those risks, and then some of the sort of the employment law implications of bringing people back to work following either working from home or furlough, some of the problems you might encounter, some of the risks might be, and then just a short bit about preparing for the future, whether or not you need to make some changes to your business as you come into this brave new world post COVID-19. So I've set out there the stay alert message. We all saw last week the government changed its policy from stay at home to stay alert, although the message is still stay at home as much as possible. And the message still is, at this time, work home if you can. So home working is still something that is strongly encouraged by the government. But what they're now saying is, if you can't work from home, if your business requires your employees to come into the workplace, then you need to start having that conversation with your employees about what that's going to look like. And all of these measures in their stay alert message need to be taken into account. So it's about limiting contact, it's about keeping 2 meters apart, it's about hygiene. And as I say, it starts with your health and safety obligations. Obviously, you will be aware as employers that you have a duty at all times to make sure you are looking after the health, safety and welfare of your employees as far as reasonably practicable. And that is about doing those risk assessments, having in place a policy, having in place measures to limit and control risks, having somebody who is appointed to make sure that they are implementing that, sharing information. Implementation is a key aspect of what it is you're going to have to do over the next month or so as you prepare your workplace for getting staff back. It's not just a once and done deal. That obligation to implement and to review that risk assessment is going to be ongoing as we see the impact of the relaxation of the rules and what that's going to look like. And it's your duty, just to emphasize, it's your duty to look after the health and safety and welfare of your staff. You can't delegate that to anyone else. So it very much rests on your shoulders. So you may have seen, I've got it here, I appreciate that I'm sharing the screen so you might not be able to see it, but the government has put together a certificate, I guess you might call it, that it's encouraging you to sign and date, that you can say, these are the 5 steps I have taken in order to make sure my workplace is COVID-19 secure. So that's about doing the risk assessment and sharing the results with your staff, having your hygiene procedures in place. Again, that emphasis on taking all reasonable steps to help people to work from home, taking all reasonable steps to maintain that 2 meter distance in the workplace. And if you can't do these things, it's about doing everything that's practical to manage the transmission risk. So really, I want to look at what you need to do when it comes to your risk assessment. Now, risk assessments are going to be individual to your type of business. There's no one size fits all for this. It depends on what your business is and how you operate and where you work. Whether or not you're in offices, whether or not you have more of a sort of factory setting, it's going to look different. But these sort of 5 key bullet points are what your risk assessment really needs to cover. And my advice is do it now. Even if you are in a position where you can continue keeping your staff at home for perhaps another month, or at least another few weeks, you need to start thinking about your risk assessment now. Because as I say, my view is that it starts with the risk assessment and it starts with the health and safety, because the moment you start asking your employees to go back into the office, I would expect that the first, or one of the first questions that they are going to ask is, well, okay, but what are you doing to make sure that I am safe when I come into the office? And as the government certificate says, it's about sharing that risk assessment as well. So my view is that when you first start talking to staff, you're going to want that risk assessment ready to share so that they can see everything that you have done or are planning to do to keep them safe. So you need to make sure that this is all written down. So the first thing is to identify the work activities or the situations that might cause transmission of the virus. So again, that's about looking at what your workspace is like, whether or not it's an office or a factory, whether or not you are open plan, whether or not individuals have their own office spaces, looking at your shared facilities, thinking about those employees who might be on the road. So I've put down a few suggestions of some of the things that you're going to have to think about: workstations, desk spaces, people sat side by side, people sat on pods together, whether or not you have screens between them, communal areas, so your kitchens, your dining areas, your breakout spaces, bathrooms, obviously, shared equipment, things like printers and photocopiers, where people maybe have codes that they have to punch into the machine. Obviously, that means they're going to be touching things, and then somebody else is going to come along and touch them as well. So all these things that you need to think about, what it is, who might be at risk. I mean, that is a fairly easy answer, which is, you know, everybody who's going to be coming into the office is going to be at some degree of risk, but then there are those who are at a higher risk than others. So those that are clinically extremely vulnerable, and those that are generally considered to be vulnerable, the NHS calls them those with a moderate risk. So the clinically extremely vulnerable people are those that the government has written to say you really should be shielding. They're the ones that have had organ transplants. They might be having treatment for certain types of cancer, lung diseases like cystic fibrosis or severe asthma, those that have a higher risk of infection than others, pregnant women with heart disease. And then you have the vulnerable. So those are the ones that still carry a higher risk but aren't necessarily extremely vulnerable. So older workers, those that are 70 or older, those that are pregnant, lung conditions, kidney disease, heart disease, liver disease, nervous system conditions, immune system problems, that sort of thing. So all of those you're going to have to take into account. You're going to have to know your staff and know who they are and what medical problems they might have that you need to build into your risk assessment. How likely is it that somebody could be exposed? Again, it's about looking at how much contact people are having with each other in your workplace. And then it's about looking at what you could do to remove the activity or the situation or otherwise control the risk. So looking back at this idea of breakout rooms and shared dining rooms, etc., you know, is that going to be something that you might think, well, actually, we ought to limit, close down our breakout rooms so that people aren't gathering in a small space on their breaks, where we can't control them being 2 meters apart. Again, this is where it comes down to, it's got to be individual to your workplace, because it depends on the size of the area. You might have a lovely big room that actually you can separate out tables and chairs so that people can stay 2 meters apart, or you might have to take other measures to control that. And again, it's all about implementation. So if you are taking measures to either remove an activity or a situation or controlling the risk, then that is something that you need to keep under review. It's all well and good telling staff, this is what we're going to do and we're doing it from day one, but people are people, and things will slip and people will become complacent, and so you as the employer need to make sure that you are keeping an eye on it on a constant basis. So I thought it might be helpful to think about how you might control the risks, because, you know, the idea of eliminating risks entirely is not necessarily practical. So a large part of what you need to do is think about how you might control these risks. And these are just some ideas and some examples of things that you might want to think about. So a temporary change to someone's job role or their duties, if you have somebody whose part of their job puts them at particularly high risk, is it something that you can remove from their job on a temporary basis and say, well, do everything else, but don't do this because this is higher risk than everything else. And we want to protect you from that way. Should you think about asking people to come in and to do something slightly different than they would normally do because you've had to adjust your business model? You can't get them to do their normal job because that carries a significant risk, but there are perhaps some other things that they wouldn't normally do, which they could usefully come back into the office and start doing. It's a change to their job roles. You still need to act reasonably, but I think in general, the idea that there is flexibility on both sides as we come out of this and as we start getting people back into the workplace is an entirely reasonable expectation to have. So it's reasonable for you to expect your employees to be flexible in the work they do. Of course, you wouldn't necessarily be asking someone to come in and clean the toilets, for example, for various reasons, but to ask somebody to perhaps do more basic admin tasks than they would normally do, I think reasonable in the circumstances. Adopting a flexible working approach, so thinking about how you might manage the staff that are coming into the office, continuing to allow people to work from home, even on a short-term basis or a couple of days a week. So again, it's about limiting numbers that come into the office. So you might have a business where you're saying, well, actually, we need you in the office because this part of our business can't function as effectively with people working from home. So we've been making do over the last couple of months, but we really need people to start coming into the office to do other things and to do other jobs in order to kickstart this part of the business. Fine, but does that require them to be in the office 5 days a week, or could you still keep them working from home 2-3 days a week so that you're limiting footfall and limiting the amount of exposure that they have to other people? The employee's commute to work is something that has come up a few times, whether or not that falls within your remit. It's not a workplace. This is really talking about those that are coming into work through public transport. If you've got employees who are walking or driving or coming by bike and they're on their own, then that's one thing. But those that might come in by tube or by train or by bus may well be concerned about the exposure they're going to have and the risk that they're going to take in getting onto public transport, especially if the trains and the buses are busy. So as I say, it's not the place of work, but there is some precedent in the case law that suggests that it may fall within your remit. So my advice would be think about it. It's all part of the conversation you should be having with staff. I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but it's all part of the conversation you should be having with staff. How to about how they're going to come back into work and the concerns that they have. Staggering start and end times, again, it's all about managing the number of people in the office and whether or not you can stagger start and end times, perhaps for those who do come in on public transport so that they are not travelling in rush hour. Maintaining social distancing, as I said, the rules on 2 meters still needs to apply as much as possible. So do you need to think about rearranging your workplace or making changes to the spaces you have? As I said, if you've got people that work side by side or people working on pods, do they have screens between them? Can you separate out any of the desks to create more space? Do you need to think a bit like the supermarkets? Should you think about having a one-way system around your office so that people aren't passing each other and crossing each other and everybody is flowing in the same direction? Staggered rest breaks are a good idea. Some businesses may already have quite rigid rest break times. Some may be a bit more flexible and just say you should take your lunch break at any time, but you might want to think about imposing some rules, again, even not just on a temporary basis. Staggering rest breaks, it can have sort of an impact in 2 ways. One, if if you've got people working close together and you stagger their rest breaks, it means that some are away from their desk while others are working. And again, that's helping maintain the 2-metre distance. But also those that are sharing kitchen space or sharing tables, breakout areas, etc. You're limiting the number of people in those spaces at one time, rather than it getting to 1 o'clock and all of your workforce suddenly turning up in the kitchen and crowding around each other. Hygiene, of course, is key. May well be something that you had implemented before the lockdown and before people were furloughed and before people were working from home, about what you need to have in place in your workplace to protect people. So it's all about having plenty of soap, lots of signs telling people to make sure they're washing their hands, lots of cleaning, lots of hand washing facilities, hand sanitizer, having that dotted around the office, perhaps around shared facilities. So if somebody is using a shared photocopier or a shared printer, making sure there's hand sanitizer there so that they're using it before and after they're touching the equipment. Additional facilities, is there anything you can do to offer additional facilities? So for example, one idea I've seen floated around is having some sort of shower facility in place. Perhaps for those that are coming in on public transport, they might want to arrive at work and have a shower and clean themselves off before they then go into the workplace. And then cleaning as well. I mean, I'm sure that you will have already provisions in place to make sure that your offices, your workplaces are clean, but there is going to be a higher expectation that you know, a deeper clean is going to need to be done to make sure that any possible traces of the virus are eliminated on a daily basis. So moving on then to some of the sort of the legal points and the practicalities of getting people back to work. It means ending whatever is in place at the moment, whether or not they're working from home or whether or not they're on furlough. So the first thing you should always do is check the contractual position. And really that's likely to be the letter or the email, whatever it was, where you put it in writing telling staff that they were working from home or that they were on furlough, to determine, you know, essentially, is there a notice period? Your contract of employment, I suspect, won't have any sort of notice periods in that way. So it's really about whether or not you've tied yourself and said, well, we can end this at any time, or we will end this on a week's notice or 2 weeks' notice. So the first thing to do is just check what the contractual position is. And then it's about being sensible. It's about being sensible. It's about being realistic. It's about being reasonable, and it may be about being creative as well. And communication with your staff is another key principle. You really need to be talking to your staff, not only about your plans for the office, your plans for the business, your plans for getting them back to work, but also making sure that you understand what they're going through, and what limitations they might have themselves for getting back into the office, whether that is practical issues like childcare. You know, it's entirely possible and to be expected that you may have some employees saying, well, I can't come back to work until the schools are open, or the nursery is open, or holiday club is open, or my children can go off to their grandparents for a day to be looked after so that I can physically make it into the office. So you need to be doing that assessment with your staff and understanding what it is that might be impacting their ability to come back to work. And then you may also have some staff who are just generally concerned about the situation, are genuinely concerned about COVID-19 and the risk of infection. And that comes back to the risk assessment and everything you're doing to make your workplace safe. So one of the questions we are seeing more and more at the moment as people are preparing for this is, can an employee refuse to return to work? Now, obviously, if they're clinically extremely vulnerable, the answer is yes, because it would be going against all of the government guidance to require somebody who should be shielding to come back to work. Vulnerable workers will need to form part of your risk assessment. They may well need to remain on furlough or remain working from home because they're vulnerable, depending on what your workplace is and what your ability is to eliminate or control those risks to them. Where that risk is higher, they're in a higher risk category than somebody who is in general good health. Childcare, as I say, those with children at home or dependents at home where they have responsibilities and they are limited in what they can do. The general principle is it's the employee's responsibility to arrange for somebody to be looking after their children or taking care of their dependents, because they are contractually obliged to come into work under their contract of employment. But before you get to that point of drawing a line and saying, well, I'm sorry, the contract says you need to come to work and I now need to insist on it, you do need to you yourself need to be flexible and reasonable in what you do. Employees have the right to unpaid time off for emergency situations. Now, normally that is expected to be sort of 2-3 days whilst they make alternative arrangements. But in this situation, that statutory right is likely to be extended to say, well, actually, if you can't come back to work, you're entitled to the unpaid time off. But obviously that is not going to be sensible or practical for your business, because ultimately you do need that person to be working in order to help your business get back to normal. So whilst you can rely on that, potentially, that's not necessarily in your business's best interests. So again, it comes down to the conversation. It might be that you need to give them more notice than other people. So it might be that you say to some people, okay, we're going to reopen the office next week, but for those that come to you and say, well, I need more time, you say, well, okay, I'll give you more time to make your arrangements. You can have 2, 3, 4 weeks to make your arrangements and come back to work, and you can continue to be working from home or on furlough until then, but setting a deadline that is reasonable. Health and safety risks again. So the next slide talks about sort of particular legal risks around those that raise health and safety risks. So as I said earlier, employees may well be legitimately concerned for health and safety and coming back into the office and increasing their exposure to other people. The legislation talks about having a reasonable belief in a serious and imminent danger. So this is all going to come down to your discussions with your employees and the risk assessment and alleviating any concerns that they have. And questioning at what point it becomes unreasonable that somebody might refuse to come to work for a health and safety risk that you have properly dealt with as part of your risk assessment. And then, you get to the point of saying, well, if an employee is refusing to return to work, is that a reasonable instruction? And therefore, is that a refusal to follow a reasonable instruction? And that is something that I may be able to discipline or dismiss an employee about. It's always going to come down to the particular circumstances. So there's no right or wrong answer that I can give you at this time. You've got to look at it on a case-by-case basis. I guess I would say be cautious about getting to that point too quickly. Again, it comes back to the same message that I've been giving throughout, which is talk to your staff and communicate. And what can you as the employer do that can help your employees come back to work? So the particular legal risks, so employees are cannot be subjected to any detriment, cannot be dismissed because they have raised health and safety concerns, so because they have this reasonable belief in a serious and imminent danger. So this comes back to what I was saying about disciplining someone for refusing to follow a reasonable instruction. Would they then say, well, if you're disciplining me, that's a detriment because I've raised a health and safety concern? So hence my warning, don't jump to that position too quickly. Have those conversations, have that investigation. In terms of unfair dismissal for raising a health and safety concern, that's what we call an automatic unfair dismissal. So there is no requirement for a 2 years service to be able to bring that claim, and there would be no cap on compensation either. So you really don't want to find yourself in that position. Pregnant workers, if you can't make reasonable adjustments for any pregnant workers, then you still have the option, for the time being at least, of the furlough scheme or home working. If it may get to the point where you have to think about medically suspending pregnant workers if you can't eliminate those risks by making those reasonable adjustments. But that is medical suspension on full pay. So you're better off using the furlough scheme, whatever that's going to look like beyond July. Then we have unfair dismissal. So if it's any sort of dismissal, a constructive dismissal or an actual dismissal not related to health and safety rules, then health and safety concerns, then the usual rules are going to apply. So if you're talking about a conduct dismissal because somebody's refused to follow a reasonable instruction or somebody's failed to turn up to work, then you're still looking at the range of reasonable responses test, and tribunals are going to be looking at the situation. You know, we're in unprecedented times. There is no sort of substantial case law on that would help us know how a tribunal could look at this situation. So it's all about acting reasonably. And discrimination matters as well. Disability discrimination is quite an obvious risk there, I would say, especially for those who are clinically extremely vulnerable or vulnerable. For those with medical conditions, they may feel that they're being treated less favourably because of their medical conditions, or that they are being asked to do something that puts them at more of a disadvantage compared to their colleagues who don't share their disability, or generally if they feel that the company isn't making reasonable adjustments as it should do. And then we have sex discrimination as well, is another potential risk. Typical example of that would be perhaps a female employee who has primary childcare responsibilities and who feels that she is being treated less favourably, or because she has to take reduced pay because she can't come to work because of her children, compared to those who have more flexibility because they don't have children. As long as it is not a direct discrimination claim, you can objectively justify any potential discrimination. So that is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. So if you are in a situation where you are having to do something and you recognise that there is a discrimination risk, then before you do it, my advice is always think about, if you're in that worst case scenario where you have this allegation of discrimination, what would your objective justification be? So what is your legitimate aim, and have you acted proportionately? Have you exhausted all other options before you've taken this particular measure? And then just finally, in terms of preparing for the future, we have the job retention scheme, putting people on furlough. That's in place now until October. It's in place in its current form until the end of July. So that's 80% capped at £2,500. Those percentages, that figure is still going to continue till the end of till the end of October. But from August, the Chancellor says that there's going to be a shared cost. We don't know what that's going to be. Hopefully next week we should get more information and should know what that's going to actually look like. There's been sort of rumours saying that employers are going to have to meet 50% of the cost. So I would say once that information does come out, you need to start looking at your business plans and your finances to determine what you can afford moving forwards. If you are thinking about changing terms of employment or restructuring and changing job roles as a result, because I think that for a lot of people this has sort of encouraged them to look at what their contracts look like, look at what their structures are. is it working? Was it working before, and is it going to work in the future? And changes may need to be made. So all of these things will need consultation. So again, start thinking about it now, because you need to build in that time to have that consultation with your staff if you're thinking of making changes. And redundancies is a sort of an unfortunate expectation as we come out of the lockdown. I think in some cases the furlough scheme will have saved jobs, in other cases it may well have just delayed the inevitable, unfortunately. So you may find that going in, as you start to build up your business and making those changes and restructuring, that you do need to make changes and reduce your workforce in certain ways. So the usual principles are going to apply when it comes to making redundancies. You need to make sure that you warn and consult your staff. You need to make sure that you adopt a fair basis for selection, and you need to make sure that you look at any alternative employment options. And depending on the size of your workforce, if you have 20 or more redundancies contemplated, then you need to build in your 30-day minimum collective consultation, appointing your employee representatives, etc. So some of these things will take time. So again, start thinking about it now, and start building that into your plans for getting your staff back to work. That's it from me in terms of the formal presentation. I'm going to hand back over to Richard now, who's going to lead us through the Q&A section.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And just a quick question, if I may, before we start to dig into the Q&A on the sides there. I've been hearing a fair bit about people talking about temperature checking of staff as they come through, and indeed one of our IoD Surrey members has a business that is selling temperature checking stuff for offices and shops at the moment. What's your thinking about temperature checking for staff coming on premises?
Yeah, it's sort of a topic that's being discussed a lot at the moment. I mean, at the moment, it's something that's being discussed, but it's not something that's being recommended by anyone. It's not being recommended by the government or by the HSE. So it may be something that you want to introduce, but you need to think about, is this going to be effective? Is this going to get me the information that I need to manage, you know, who's coming in and out of the office? Who's going to be checking it? You know, do I have somebody who is trained, or not necessarily medically trained, but somebody who understands what it is they need to do in order to get the relevant information? How do you know that somebody with a high temperature, that's a symptom of COVID-19 versus a symptom of something else, albeit a high temperature may well suggest that somebody is ill, whether or not that's COVID-19 or not. But if somebody has a high temperature, that may well suggest that somebody is not very well and shouldn't be at work anyway. And thinking about the practicalities of what happens if you have an employee who fails the test, or what happens if you have an employee who refuses it. Is that a sign that they're trying to hide something, maybe, or is that just a sign that some people don't like the intrusion of somebody taking their temperature? It says, well, I can be responsible for myself, and if I have a temperature, I will tell you. I don't need you to do it for me. Okay.
Right. So it's situational.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, at the moment, my feeling is, you know, using caution around having that as a requirement. It might be something that you ask people to do on a voluntary basis, but in terms of having it as a requirement, I would use caution at the moment on that.
And I guess
you know, think about, you know, that sort of thing brings in a whole sort of question about data protection.
Sure. And I guess if you introduce something, then, you know, arguably you're more liable. I'd like to move on. Gary Smith, you've asked a question. Could you sort of activate yourself, please, and ask your question to Michelle?
Certainly. Hi, everyone. I'm just trying to think which one. I asked a few questions. So is there an existing questionnaire or content we can use to establish vulnerability levels of individuals? So obviously we want to categorise people effectively in terms of how we treat them from a risk point of view. Is there any kind of guidance on the specific questions we should be asking to make sure that we're not all looking at different requirements?
Not that I have seen. I think it's about looking at looking at the lists that are out there on either the government website or NHS England's website about who classes as it's clinically extremely vulnerable. I mean, people are going to know that because they'll have had the letters from the government, but then looking at the list of those that are vulnerable and asking staff to let you know if they feel that they have a condition, whether or not they're on that list or otherwise. But it comes down to the communication and just asking the question, do you have a medical condition that you think puts you at higher risk compared to others? It's be as simple as that.
I'm not sure if I saw something around that on the IoD coronavirus hub, actually. So what I'll do, Gary, is I will also check to see if there's anything around that on the IoD coronavirus hub.
Okay.
Yeah, that might be, because it's always good to have some sort of guidelines to sort of work from, you know, if for nothing else, just to demonstrate due diligence and due process.
Yeah, and again, just trying to make sure you're consistent. I think that's the key thing. Is, you know, it's all very well us going, yeah, well, I've determined that you are extremely vulnerable or not, well, based upon what criteria, and I think Michelle's articulated that in terms of the NHS side of things. So we'll need to refer to that, I think.
Yeah, and just remember, when you sort of going back to my sort of my answer to Richard's question, which was about when you're collecting that information, just remember that's personal data. So you need to make sure that you are collecting it and storing it and handling it in the right, in the right way, not sharing it with too many people. You know, if you've got Joe Bloggs who isn't coming to work because of a medical condition that nobody knows about, you don't want to be saying to everybody, oh, Joe Bloggs isn't here because of X, Y, Z. So you need to think about your data protection obligations at the same time.
Cool. I appreciate that. Luckily, we're an organisation that does IT services and information security, so it's kind of
part and parcel.
Hopefully, we'll be able to sort that out. Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the other questions I sort of asked while I'm on is that how do you balance mental health with a vulnerability? So, for example, if we had a pregnant member of staff who's struggling working from home because of the isolation aspects of that, that's kind of a difficult call, isn't it?
Yeah, it is difficult, and we've already seen that with people saying, well, I've got staff who really want to come back to work, before it's really safe to do so. I think in these circumstances, the physical health is almost going to trump it to an extent that until you can offer a safe place to work, allowing them to physically come back into the office would be a risky thing to do. So it's about looking at the other options in terms of, well, what support can I offer my staff if they are struggling with their mental health whilst they're feeling isolated and working from home, and I can't change that for them at the moment because I can't get them back into the office because there are too many people or there are too many risks and I need to make changes. Is there any other support that I can offer them as far as mental health concerned, in terms of sort of, the charities that are out there that help people with mental health problems.
Okay, and as an employer, where does the responsibility for that decision lie? The individual can't just turn around and go, well, I don't care, I want to come into the office. I know, so there is no concept of zero risk. So therefore, so if I determine the risk is okay, and say you can go back in, and that turns out to be at fault, does that put me in a bad place?
Well, that will depend on the risk assessment that you've done. So if you followed the government guidance and you've done your risk assessment and something comes up that was unexpected, then that's different to you just saying, well, I think everything's okay, but I don't have anything to back it up.
No, that's fair.
that sort of scenario is always going to.
I'm going to move us on. I'm going to move us on with everyone's permission here. Thank you so much, Gary. Rob Smith, you got a problem? Not a problem, but a question.
Not a problem. No, it's really
Rob's got no problems. Let me just articulate. Rob has got no problems. Rob, over to you.
No, it just suddenly occurred to me during these unusual times whether the liability of employees is extended to when a person leaves home as opposed to when they arrive in the office, given that they might be happy to arrive in the office, but that means getting there exposes them to undue risk, like travelling on the tube or on public transport. Do you have a view on that at all, Michelle?
Yeah, so I was talking about this idea of does the employee's commute to work fall within your responsibility as an employer? And there's a case that everybody is banding around at the moment that was all to do with employees commuting to work during the snowfall. And that case determined that the employer was at fault because they were requiring employees to travel into work and to be driving up a road that was deemed sort of closed or unsafe by by the local authorities. So goes back to my point of saying, potentially thinking about employees' commutes into work is something that you should be covering in your risk assessment sensibly in order to show that you have thought about everything.
Okay, thank you. That answers the question well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Jeff Clark, you've asked a question about coronavirus SSP. Would you care to articulate that question for Michelle, please?
Yeah, Richard, I've asked us 3 questions, actually. Did you want me to just stick to the coronavirus one? Or
stick to that one, please. That'd be great.
Okay. Well, we've got some people who are in isolation. They've produced the required documentation. But they're not, they're self-isolating. So it's because some of their relatives have an issue. Is it, number one, unreasonable for us to ask them to do some work? And number 2, are we able to claim coronavirus SSP for the days they do work?
Cool.
Well, SSP is only payable, so they've changed the SSP rules so that if you are shielding, if you are sick or you are shielding because of coronavirus, then you would be entitled to, if you're not furloughed, you would be entitled to statutory sick pay. So statutory sick pay wouldn't extend to somebody who is at home because they live with somebody who perhaps is shielding. So that individual is either taking holiday or they're furloughed or, they've taken, they're on sort of unpaid leave, whatever arrangements you put in place. So if they are willing and capable of working and they can do some work from home, then absolutely you can ask them to do some work from home, even if that's not something that's built into the contract. Again, it comes down to making changes to terms of employment that are reasonable in the circumstances and being able to ask your staff to work from home. The bigger question would be if you've got somebody who lives with somebody who is vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable, and you are asking them to come into work to expose themselves, and they're worried about coming to work, coming into contact with more people, and then taking it home. Then again, that is there's no sort of specific guidance on that. That forms part of your risk assessment and part of your discussions with your employees about what can you do to alleviate those concerns with that employee to get them back in the workplace.
Super.
So let me just expand that then, if I may, Michelle. Thank you.
Very quickly, please.
So if we've got someone who is on the at-risk scenario, so is shielding, but also, and we're claiming coronavirus SSP, then we cannot make them work as well. We cannot do both. Somebody might be shielding because, for example, they're a diabetic. However, they were a diabetic before, so that they can work from home. Are we able to do both?
Well, if they are working from home, albeit they're shielding, but if they're working from home, then they're not. Then they would be entitled to normal pay because they're working. So you would only pay them SSP if they're not working.
I see. So we cannot claim the coronavirus SSP for that. Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. Ben Mellick, you've got a question also about this blurring of lines and responsibilities between work and home. Ben, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Yeah, sure, thanks. Yes, we send employees onto nuclear power stations to perform various works, and as part of that they have a range of PPE, including overalls, which they would normally take home and clean themselves. We've had a question from from one of our staff about whether we should be
Oh, you've disappeared, Ben. Okay, so Ben's sound has gone, but the question really, I guess, is I'm going to take your question forward, Ben. I think it's interesting, and your sound is sort of playing up a bit. So, Michelle, should employers who have employees who work on site be taking responsibility for cleaning their staff's overall and PPE, rather than expecting the staff to take potentially contaminated clothing home to clean?
I mean, that's going to depend on whether just running that PPE through the normal washing machine, or however they would normally wash it from home, is going to be enough to eliminate any germs or virus or any risk to the employee. So the answer would be if the answer to that is no, then the employer would have a greater responsibility to take to clean that PPE. But if their normal process of cleaning that PPE at home is sufficient to protect the health and safety risk, then they can continue doing that. So I can understand why the employee is asking the question. I guess the sort of question I have back is, well, what is it that that they think is not, what is it that by running it through the normal washing machine at home is not doing to eliminate that risk?
I think it's more about the fact that they might be more at risk of having exposure to the virus by being on site and bringing it back into the home, not so much the washing process, but just bringing it into the home, and whether we should be bringing that in through some other route into our own cleaning facility so they don't have to increase their risk at home.
Yeah, so it's something that you might want to think about and say, well, is that something that we can, again, if that is a concern that your staff have, is that something that you can reasonably and sensibly do to alleviate that concern, which is, well, fine, you know, rather than once you're finished work for the day, rather than going home, you come back to this place and that's where you leave your PPE and we'll clean it and you take some clean stuff for the next day.
Okay.
Thank you so much. There's a number of other questions, Michelle. You won't be surprised, but we are running up against the clock, and we've got 2 or 3 minutes to sort of close out this session. Michelle, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Michelle, I know it's very difficult to put stuff into writing, but perhaps you and I can have a conversation after this event and look at some of the other questions and maybe sort of just not provide advice, but maybe some sort of pointers for people to think about for those questions that we haven't been able to answer right now. Would that be okay? Yeah,
I've got no problem with that.
Okay, super, thank you. So all it remains for me to do right now is to say, look, thank you so much for joining us today. Do get in touch if you're an IoD member with me about maybe contributing your knowledge, skills and experience to the community in the same way that Michelle and others have been, especially around this returning to the workplace series. We've got 1 or 2 more lined up because the politicians and the press talk about this stuff, but it is directors and owners who are going to make it happen in the real world. So do please get back in touch with me on that. The other thing I would say is I'm in conversation with Edwin Morgan, the IoD Director of Policy, on the 22nd, and he'll be talking with me about what it's really like, sort of working with government, and what's it really like behind the black door of number 10, and you know, getting the voice of business heard. So that will be fascinating. So book into that, open to IoD and non-IoD members alike. And our mind share on the 29th of May, our 8:59 is going to be super as well. So you know, do consider booking into that to share ideas and inspirations there as well. I have put the link into the chat area again for the evaluation, and I would ask you, please, you know, I really want to make these the best they can be for you and for others. So please do take a minute. It's only a minute. It's a very short evaluation. I've just hammered it into the chat area. Please let us know what you think, what you would want to see us do differently, and we'll also take your advice and your suggestions on board. And all that remains for me to do now is to say, on your behalf, thank you to Michelle, and thank you to everybody who's joined on the call today. So thank you, stay safe, stay strong, and have a great day. Cheers for now.